Hi, I'm Grace from Gardening for Joy, and in today's video we're going to talk about preparing your garden beds. And we're going to look at two different ways to prepare a garden bed. We're going to look at a raised bed and we're going to look at an in-ground bed. Now, before we even think about preparing our beds, there's a couple things that we need to do in advance of that. One thing is we need to find a location that has 6 to 8 hours of sun a day. And then second, we need to make sure that we kill the vegetation in the area that you're going to be planting your beds. Now, we had the luxury of time, and we knew we were expanding our garden this year. And so if you look at this whole area here, which is where we're expanding the garden, what we did is we laid down a layer of about probably 4 to 6 inches of leaves. We let them sit there all winter. And then in the spring we've come and we've removed them, and most of our vegetation was killed in that process. Now, if you don't have the luxury of that type of planning and you need to get your beds prepared a little bit earlier, the other method you can use is you can lay down black plastic. Now, that method will also take about a month to kill the vegetation under there. Once you've killed the vegetation, you also are going to have to remove whatever sod pieces are left there. And of course, you want to make sure that you're able to harvest the soil from the sod that you pick up. So now let me show you how we removed the sod pieces and how we were able to capture the soil to use in the beds. So as I mentioned, once you've been able to kill the vegetation or turf grass in the area where your bed's going to be, it's really advisable to then remove the sod pieces or whatever's there from the area, and to make sure you're able to capture the soil from what you remove. So we used 3 tools for removing the sod. We used an edger, we used a flat shovel, and we used this forage cultivator to do that. Let me just demonstrate for you on a piece of sod exactly the process that we used. So first, with our edger, we simply push down around the 4 sides. In this case, it's 3 sides. So we got a good start with that. Took the flat shovel, went under there, lifted it up a little bit, and then used our forage cultivator to get under there and then to lift it up. It's a beautiful thing. Now you can see all the great soil that's in this piece of sod. Now we let this dry out, and then we used a really simple method. We had some chicken wire, right? We laid it over the top of our wheelbarrow. We actually anchored it onto the wheelbarrow. And then we picked up the sod when it was dried out. We laid it on top, and then we just got the soil out from the block. And that proved really, really helpful. And then we took the vegetation that was left and we put it in our compost pile. So that's it. So, you've picked your site, you've removed your vegetation. Now you're ready to get started with your raised bed. So here in front of me you can see that I have my first raised bed. This is 8 feet long by 4 feet wide, and then the section down here is 4 feet long by 4 feet wide. The raised bed is 12 inches high, and then the next thing is to fill it. Now before I talk about how I filled it, let's talk about a few advantages and disadvantages of raised beds. So what I like about a raised bed is, first of all, it's a very clearly defined area. I won't have any opportunity to walk on it, so there'll be no soil compaction once I get the bed established. It's also, you don't have to bend over quite as far, so a raised bed is really nice for that. And then in the spring, the soil in a raised bed is going to heat up quicker simply because it's not in the ground. So a few definite advantages to raised beds. Now there is a disadvantage also. The disadvantage is really the cost of building the raised beds, the material that you need to buy to build your frame, and then the soil that you need to purchase to fill it up. So let's look at how I'm filling up my raised bed. So as I talked about, one of my goals in filling my raised bed was to use as much of the native soil that I have here as I could. And I did this by removing the turf, the sod, and reclaiming the native soil from that sod. And this pile here is really my native soil. And I highly encourage you, if you could use your native soil, do that. But I wasn't able to get all the native soil. My goal was to have 50% of my bed have topsoil. And that was going to be made up of my native soil, but I also had to purchase some topsoil, which you see right here. So I have one section of my topsoil at this end of the bed, one section of my topsoil at this section of the bed. It's not quite 50%, but it's close enough for me. The other material that I used, which was really one part, so if we think I used 2 parts of the topsoil, which includes the native soil, then I'm using 1 part of this material called vermiculite. You can use vermiculite or you can use sand. But what this will do is it'll provide aeration for the soil and also help the soil retain moisture. The final ingredient is compost. This is some beautiful black rich compost. And this is where it's really important to read the bag or talk to the garden center for whatever you purchase. And let me just show you what I'm talking about. So if you look on the front of the bag, it says organic planting soil. Well, what does that mean, right? So I've always gotten to the habit of turning the bag over and looking for the ingredients so that I know exactly what is in the soil that I'm putting in my garden. So I think that's really important to do. Anything you buy, if it's bulk, you talk to the garden center about what's in the bulk. If it's in a bag, you look at what's on the bag. So I'm going to get this all mixed up, and then you'll see how that finally results. And really what I'm going to do is just mix these different components all together. Now you see the result of me mixing all the various ingredients or the components of the soil into the raised bed. I have about 10 quarts of soil type material in these 2 raised beds. You can see I've filled up probably about 50% of the bed with those 10 quarts. This is probably going to be good enough. There's no reason for me to fill up all 12 inches. I will continually add more compost to it each year, actually after each planting. So there you have the raised bed garden. So we talked about and we saw how I prepared a raised garden bed. Now let's talk about preparing an in-ground garden bed. Let's first talk about some of the advantages of an in-ground garden bed. Clearly one of the advantages is cost. You don't need the materials to build a raised bed, and you don't need as much soil if you're using the native soil that's in the ground that you're going to be planting your bed. Now the disadvantages are kind of the opposite of what the advantages are of a raised bed. It is easier to step into a bed that's in the ground. It's not as clearly defined as a raised bed, and yes, you do have to bend over a little bit more when you're dealing with an in-ground bed. Now here in this section of my garden, I have 3 in-ground beds. There's one here, there's another one here, and then there's a third one up there. Each of the beds are 3 feet wide by 8 feet long, and then I have 1.5 feet between the beds. I like 1.5 feet or 2 feet between the beds to give me enough room to maneuver, and also to make sure that I don't step in the beds as I'm working the beds with the vegetables. Now let's take a look at how I'm amending the soil in an in-ground bed. Now what I'm using in this in-ground bed is a lobster compost. I really wanted to amend my native soil, and so I took a little bit different approach to the compost that I'm using. So that's the black material that you see here. It's a good healthy compost that I'm going to work into the soil. I also have the vermiculite, similar to what we put in the raised bed. That again is going to give me the aeration in the soil, it's going to give me the water retention piece in the soil. And it's important to note that what I did in each of these beds is I dug down about 4 to 6 inches in the soil to use the soil that's there. So there you have the in-ground. Let me go ahead and mix up the one bed and come back and show you what that looks like. So I've incorporated all the ingredients that I talked about now into my native soil, into my in-ground bed. And I've done that for all 3 beds. Now the last thing that I want to just mention is soil testing. Now everything that I did and everything that I showed you may be fine, everything may be perfect, but you won't know for sure unless you do a soil test. So I highly encourage you to do a soil test. Any of the agricultural colleges that are in your area should be able to do one for you. Look for an extension program, but I highly encourage you to do a soil test. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.